Not every difference is a diagnosis. If you want to learn more about neurodiversity, autism, ADHD, and diagnosis than 95% of the people around you, watch this video. And if you want to put a big smile on my face, take a moment to share this video with someone else who might find it interesting. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist who specializes in working with kids and adults with neurodevelopmental differences. And even some of my colleagues in the field get some of this stuff wrong because so much of the science is still evolving. Plus, a great deal has changed over the past decade. A commenter recently asked if being introverted was the same as being neurodivergent. In order to answer it well, we need to distinguish between three critical lenses: neurotype, personality, and diagnosis. These are not the same thing. There is overlap, but sometimes the overlap is subtle, and sometimes it's non-existent. The best metaphor I can use to describe how these relate to one another actually comes from architecture. More on that later. First, let's talk about neurotype and neurodiversity. Neurodiversity refers to the naturally occurring variation in how people are wired. They're neurological traits. If you prefer using your right hand, that's a neurological trait. If you pick up on some social cues but not others, that's also a neurological trait. We use terms like neurotypical and neurodivergent to describe how someone's neurological traits fit the statistical majority. Being neurodivergent means that your traits vary from what's most common in the population. This can include differences in attention, social communication, sensory processing, and executive functioning. And the distinction between neurodivergent and neurotypical is biological, but also about the fit between the person and their environment. And that fit is shaped by culture and social norms. When a group of traits cluster together in similar developmental patterns, we call that a neurotype. Autism is a neurotype. ADHD is a neurotype. Left-handedness is technically a neurotype. Even being neurotypical is a neurotype. Again, it's about the cluster of traits. In the world of architecture, your neurotype is essentially the blueprint for how everything is structured and functions together. It determines where the load-bearing walls are, how the wiring runs, and how the plumbing is laid out. It really shapes how the whole building functions. While a blueprint does tell you how something is built, it doesn't tell you whether it qualifies for a diagnosis. And it doesn't tell you anything about how the building feels either. But that's where we're headed next. So does being introverted mean that you are neurodivergent? The answer is no, not necessarily, and here's why. Introversion is a personality trait, not a neurotype. And if a neurotype is a blueprint for how you're wired and structured, then personality is the interior design. It's the lighting, the paint color, the furniture layout. It's the emotional flavor of the space. But the interior design doesn't necessarily change the structural function. Personality is shaped by temperament, which is your biological emotional style, and by experience. Introversion and extroversion are personality traits. In the Big Five model, they sit alongside openness, conscientiousness, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And rather than labeling people as one thing or another, these traits exist on a spectrum. Your unique combination of those traits helps describe your personality. Personality can be influenced by your wiring, but it can also change over time. Research shows that on average, most adults become more introverted as they age. Your neurotype, on the other hand, reflects in how your brain and nervous system process information. And those things don't necessarily change. And while we're at it, loads of folks, including a lot of people in my own field, used to believe that ADHD was something that you could grow out of, but that's no longer supported by the research. You don't grow out of your neurodivergent traits, but you might get better at masking and hiding them because of the way society treats you. Personality differences can look similar to neurodivergence, but similar does not mean same. You can have autistic traits and not qualify for a diagnosis. That's not a contradiction, it's just about clinical thresholds. Back to our architecture analogy, if your neurotype is the blueprint and your personality is the interior design, the emotional style, then diagnosis is the code that the building instructor uses to decide when a structure meets certain criteria, especially when something might be interfering with safety or function and needs intervention. Diagnosis comes from the medical model, which understands human conditions from the frame of treatment and not necessarily through identity. It's just a classification system. And sometimes those classifications get quite specific. There's literally a billing code for being struck by a duck. Go look it up. And that doesn't mean that being duck struck is an identity. It just means medicine needs a way to categorize different events for the purposes of treatment and billing. That's really how diagnosis is supposed to work. It's about professional communication. It's about having ways of researching certain conditions that need support and treatment. But it's not about defining your entire identity. In order for something to be diagnosed, it needs to fit certain criteria, as well as meet at least one of the 4 Ds of diagnosis: dysfunction, distress, deviance, and danger. And if none of those are going on for a person, chances are they will not meet criteria for a diagnosis. For example, there are loads of people out there with ADHD and autistic traits who don't meet full criteria for a DSM diagnosis. Because of those traits, their lived experience will be more similar to people who would meet criteria for the diagnosis than it might for people who are more neurotypical. Moreover, there are also loads of people who learned to mask their traits so well that even if they were to go get evaluated by a professional today, they may not meet criteria for a diagnosis. And diagnosis, just like building codes, is heavily influenced by cultural norms and the most updated research of its time, which means it can change over time as the science and practice evolve. I'm left-handed. That's part of my neurotype, my blueprint. The majority of the population is right-handed, so technically left-handedness is neurodivergent. But my left-handedness doesn't cause dysfunction, distress, deviance, or danger, so it wouldn't meet criteria for a diagnosis. Historically, though, left-handedness was heavily stigmatized. The Latin word for left is literally sinister. Even a few hundred years ago, left-handedness was seen as a sign from the demonic. It was a deformity, something that needed to be corrected. And like other wiring differences like ADHD and autism, it only becomes a problem when the world is structured in a way that punishes it. When we collapse neurotype, personality, and diagnosis into one category, we either over-pathologize normal variation or we dilute real neurodevelopmental differences. Not every difference is a diagnosis, and the goal isn't to label everything. The goal is to understand people well enough to support them and to build environments where more kinds of minds can thrive.